The air in the 50th floor boardroom of Vance Innovations was as thin and cold as the view of the San Francisco Bay was vast. Sunlight sliced through the floor-to-ceiling windows, glinting off the sterile glass of the conference table and the polished chrome of chairs that cost more than a car. It was a sterile cathedral of commerce, built for transactions, not conversations. And the silence within it was a currency of its own, a hush of reverence reserved for the man seated at its head. Elias Vance, CEO and founder, was the room's center of gravity. His presence alone seemed to bend the light, pulling the attention of every person in the room towards him. The American legal team, a sea of dark, tailored suits, sat poised with pens hovering over pristine legal pads. Across from them, the delegation from the Saudi Royal Investment Fund waited, their faces impassive, betraying nothing. The multi-billion-dollar deal hung in this manufactured stillness, waiting for a final seal. Elias leaned forward slightly, breaking the silence not with English, the language of the contract, but with a fluid, archaic dialect of Arabic. It was the language of old pacts, of deals struck under desert stars, heavy with nuance that a textbook could never capture. He spoke a single, critical sentence regarding sovereign risk, then fell silent, his piercing blue eyes scanning the faces of his own team. A palpable disappointment settled over him as his translator, a nervous young man from Stanford, offered a clumsy, literal translation that stripped the phrase of all its power. Mr. Vance confirms, a standard assurance of mutual cooperation. He stammered. The lawyers nodded, satisfied. The deal was safe. But Elias wasn't looking at his lawyers. He was looking for a flicker of understanding, a sign that someone, anyone on his side of the table, grasped the intricate test he had just laid down. He found nothing but confident, oblivious smiles. And then, a sound. It was not from the table, but from the periphery. A soft, clear voice that cut through the stale air with unnerving precision. "Forgive me, sir," the voice said, speaking in the exact same Bedouin dialect Elias had used. "But that is not a guarantee. It is a doorway." Heads snapped around, a dozen of them, as if pulled by a single string. The collective, sharp intake of breath was the only sound. The source of the voice was a woman who, until that moment, had been nothing more than a ghost in a crisp, black uniform. She stood by the mahogany credenza, a silver water pitcher still in her hand, her name tag reading a simple, unassuming name, Amina. The silence that followed was absolute, a physical weight, as every eye in the room fixed on the serving woman who had just altered the course of a billion-dollar negotiation with a single, impossible sentence. Hours earlier, that same silence had felt different. It had been the silence of absolute control, emanating from Elias Vance's penthouse office, a space designed to command respect. The panoramic view of the Golden Gate Bridge was not a landscape. It was a conquest, a testament to the empire he had built from nothing. He stood before the vast expanse of glass, a custom-tailored suit hanging on his frame with the ease of a second skin, listening to his chief operating officer, Marcus Thorne, deliver the morning report. The final risk assessment is nominal. "Elias," Marcus said, his voice smooth and reassuring. Legal has triple-checked every clause. The Saudi fund is eager to sign. This deal solidifies our market position for the next decade. Elias didn't turn. He kept his gaze fixed on the fog rolling in from the Pacific, a grey shroud slowly consuming the city. Nominal risk is still risk. Marcus, have you personally reviewed the sovereign immunity addendums? Of course, Marcus replied without a beat of hesitation. It's boilerplate, nothing to worry about. For 3 years, ever since Lena had passed, this had become his world a fortress of data, projections, and the unshakable belief that numbers, unlike people, could not lie. He trusted Marcus implicitly, had mentored him for over a decade, seeing him as the son he never had and the loyal successor who understood that emotion was a liability in their world. He had become a man who operated on logic alone, a king ruling an empire of algorithms and code, deliberately blinding himself to the messy, unpredictable world of human nature that had once brought him so much pain. His eyes drifted to the single photograph allowed on his minimalist desk. It was of Lena, taken on their last trip to Big Sur. Her smile was effortless, her eyes full of a light that he had once mirrored but now could barely recall. The ache was a phantom limb, a constant, dull throb just beneath the surface of his icy composure. He had poured his grief into the company, transforming it into a relentless, profit-driven machine. In doing so, he had sealed himself off, convinced that vulnerability was the source of his suffering. He was powerful, respected, and utterly, profoundly alone. He was so insulated by his wealth and routine that he failed to notice the subtle cracks forming in the foundations of his perfect world. He didn't see the nervous glances exchanged between junior executives when Marcus entered a room. He didn't hear the hushed whispers about deals that seemed too good to be true. He didn't feel the growing disconnect between the values Lena had helped him build the company on: integrity, innovation, humanity, and the cold, hard pragmatism that now governed his every decision. He was a man standing atop a gleaming glass tower, oblivious to the fact that the glass was beginning to fracture beneath his feet, the fissures spreading silently from the very core of his trusted inner circle. Down in the labyrinthine service corridors of the hotel where the Vance Innovation Summit was being held, the air smelled of industrial cleaner and quiet desperation. This was Amina Diallo's world now, a place of hushed efficiency where her existence was measured by her invisibility. She moved with a practiced grace, her steps silent on the polished concrete floors, her posture erect, a habit ingrained from a life that once demanded a different kind of presence. To the executives she served, she was a pair of hands offering water, clearing plates, blending seamlessly into the background. They never saw her eyes, which missed nothing. She saw the subtle tells of a negotiation, the almost imperceptible tensing of a jaw, the way a senior partner would tap his pen when a clause was contentious, the feigned confidence in a junior lawyer's smile. She had once been trained to read these signs from across a boardroom table. Now, she observed them from the sidelines, a silent, unseen analyst. Her uniform, functional and drab, was a stark contrast to the life it concealed. Her small apartment was filled not with fashion magazines, but with stacks of books on geopolitical strategy and international finance, their pages dog-eared and highlighted. Tonight, as she prepared the service cart for the final meeting, her supervisor handed her a list of directives. The Saudi delegation only drinks Evian, room temperature. Mr. Vance's team gets Voss, chilled. And whatever you do, he warned, his eyes wide with the stress of the event. Do not interrupt, do not speak, do not exist. Got it? Amina simply nodded, her expression placid. She understood the rules better than he knew. She had spent the last 2 years mastering the art of being overlooked, a painful necessity after returning to San Francisco. Her mother's long, brutal fight with cancer had consumed her savings and left a 2-year chasm in a resume that had once been stellar. When she tried to re-enter her field, recruiters saw only the gap, the time away. They saw a risk, not an asset. The fact that she was a black woman in a world dominated by men in crisp white shirts only made their polite rejections quicker. As she arranged the bottles on a silver tray with meticulous precision, her mind was miles away, passing the fragments of conversation she had overheard earlier in the hallway. Marcus Thorne had been speaking with the lead translator, his tone dismissive. Just stick to the approved script. Don't get creative. Elias likes to throw these little cultural curveballs. Your job is to smooth them over, not analyze them. The phrase, smooth them over, snagged in her mind. It was a term used to mask, to obscure, to deliberately misrepresent. A quiet alarm bell, faint but persistent, began to ring in the back of her consciousness. Tucked into the side pocket of her worn handbag in the staff locker was a small, leather-bound Arabic dictionary, a gift from her father, a diplomat who had raised her in the heart of the Middle East. It was a relic from a past life, a world of embassy dinners and complex negotiations. She hadn't opened it in years, but like a muscle, the knowledge remained, dormant but ready. She took a final look at her reflection in the polished surface of the water pitcher, a face she barely recognized. Tired, but with a fire in the eyes that no uniform could completely extinguish, and pushed the cart out into the corridor, gliding silently toward the 50th floor. The collision happened in the hushed, carpeted corridor just outside the main boardroom. It was less a physical impact and more a clash of two worlds that were never meant to touch. Amina was maneuvering the heavy service cart around a corner, her movements precise and economical, when Marcus Thorne burst out of a side office, his phone pressed to his ear, his face a mask of irritation. He wasn't looking where he was going, his entire being consumed by the conversation he was having. No, you tell them the funds are non-negotiable. He snapped into the phone. I don't care what the preliminary report says. Bury it. He pivoted sharply, his polished Italian loafer catching the wheel of Amina's cart. The cart jolted, and a single bottle of Voss water tipped, rolled off the silver tray, and shattered on the marble floor with a sound that seemed to tear through the hallway's quiet reverence. Water and glass sprayed across the floor, a small, chaotic disruption in a world built on order. Amina reacted instantly, her body moving to contain the damage, grabbing a linen napkin to absorb the spill. Marcus, however, barely registered her. He ended his call with an abrupt curse and glared down at the mess as if it were a personal affront. "Watch where you're going," he sneered, his voice dripping with condescension. He didn't look at her face, only at her uniform, at the spill, at the disruption she represented. "My apologies, sir. It was an accident," Amina said, her voice even, as she carefully picked up the larger shards of glass. But Marcus wasn't interested in apologies. He needed a target for the frustration simmering from his phone call, and she was the perfect, powerless one. "An accident, or incompetence," he said, his voice loud enough for a passing junior associate to hear and quickly look away. "Your only job is to push a cart and pour water, and you can't even manage that. Is it that complicated?" Elias Vance, on his way to the boardroom, had just turned the same corner. He stopped, a silent observer to the entire exchange. He saw his COO, his trusted right hand, berating a service employee over a trivial spill. He saw the disdain in Marcus's posture, the cruel, dismissive curl of his lip. And he saw Amina, kneeling on the floor, her back straight, her movements dignified as she cleaned up the mess created by another man's carelessness. For a fleeting second, a memory of Lena surfaced, a quiet word she had spoken to him years ago after he had been short with a waiter. "The measure of a man, Elias, is not how he treats his equals, but how he treats those he believes are beneath him." The memory was a pinprick, a momentary discomfort, but Elias, blinded by years of trusting Marcus, chose to dismiss it. He saw the situation through the lens of corporate hierarchy. Marcus was stressed before a major deal, and the employee had made a clumsy mistake. It was unpleasant, but not his concern. He remained silent, a tacit endorsement of Marcus's behavior. His silence was a judgment. It was a clear, unspoken statement that in his world, a woman on her knees cleaning up broken glass was invisible, her dignity irrelevant. He gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod to Marcus, a signal to wrap it up, and then continued into the boardroom without a word. The act was a small betrayal, not just of Amina, but of the man Lena had once believed him to be. And it was this small act of cruel indifference that would set the stage for the resounding crack that was about to shatter his world. Amina entered the boardroom moments later, her composure a mask of serene professionalism. The broken glass had been cleared, a fresh bottle of water replaced, and any trace of the ugly confrontation in the hallway had been erased from her expression. She moved with the same silent efficiency as before, gliding around the table to fill water glasses, her presence once again relegated to the background. Marcus Thorne, now seated at Elias's right hand, didn't even grant her a glance. To him, she had already ceased to exist. The meeting resumed. The energy was tense, the final details of the multi-billion-dollar partnership being ironed out. It was then that Elias, wanting to assert a level of cultural fluency and test the acuity of both his team and his new partners, leaned forward. He spoke the complex Arabic phrase, the words flowing with the authority of a man who knew their weight. The silence that followed his translator's inadequate interpretation was the sound of opportunity slipping away. It was the sound of a carefully laid test failing. Instead of reacting with the anger she felt, instead of allowing the humiliation from the hallway to fuel a bitter outburst, Amina did something far more powerful. She chose precision over passion. From her position by the wall, she took a single, deliberate step forward. It wasn't a large movement. but in the hyper-aware stillness of the room, it was a seismic shift. She placed the silver water pitcher on the credenza with a soft, definitive click, a sound that drew every eye. And then she spoke. Her voice, clear and unwavering, addressed Elias directly in his chosen dialect. Thưa ngài, đó không phải là một sự đảm bảo, đó là một cánh cửa. Sir, that is not a guarantee, it is a doorway. The effect was instantaneous and absolute. The Saudi delegates, who had been listening with polite detachment, sat bolt upright, their eyes wide with disbelief. Elias's own translator blanched, his mouth falling slightly open as he stared at her. Utterly dumbfounded, Marcus Thorne, who had been whispering to the lawyer beside him, froze mid-sentence, his head snapping towards the source of the voice with a look of pure, unadulterated shock. Elias Vance himself felt a jolt, as if the room had suddenly tilted on its axis. He stared at the serving woman, truly seeing her for the first time. The uniform, the tray, the subservient posture she had held just moments before it all dissolved, replaced by the image of a woman of startling intelligence and composure. She hadn't just understood his words, she had understood his intent. She had seen the hidden lock in his sentence and presented him with the key. She did not flinch under his intense scrutiny. Her gaze was steady, respectful, but firm. It was the gaze of an equal. In that moment, she was not a maid. She was the most perceptive person in the room. And her quiet, two-sentence intervention had just done what his entire high-priced legal team could not. It had saved him from walking into his own trap. The air crackled with the unspoken question hanging over the billion-dollar table. Who was this woman? The spell was finally broken by Elias. He raised a hand, a slow, deliberate gesture that commanded the room's absolute attention. His eyes never left Amina's. "The meeting is suspended," he announced, his voice a low, resonant baritone that left no room for argument. "We will reconvene tomorrow at noon." A wave of confusion and muted protest rippled through his American team. Marcus Thorne started to speak. "Elias, we're moments from closing tomorrow," Elias repeated, his tone final. He then turned to the Saudi delegation and, in flawless Arabic, offered a gracious apology for the interruption, assuring them that a brief pause was necessary to ensure perfect alignment. The lead delegate, a man with shrewd, intelligent eyes, glanced from Elias to Amina, a flicker of deep respect in his expression. He simply nodded, accepting the delay without question. As the room began to empty, a chaotic ballet of shuffled papers and whispered conversations, Elias stood. His gaze swept past his bewildered legal team, past a visibly furious Marcus Thorne, and settled once more on Amina. "You," he said, the single word sharp and clear. "Stay." Amina remained by the credenza as the last of the executives filed out, their curious backward glances a testament to the disruption she had caused. The heavy boardroom doors clicked shut, leaving the three of them, Elias, Marcus, and Amina, in a silence now charged with confrontation. Marcus was the first to speak, his voice tight with barely controlled rage. "What in the hell was that?" "Elias, You're going to let a caterer derail a multi-billion-dollar deal. She should be fired on the spot for insubordination." Elias turned to Marcus, his expression unreadable, carved from stone. "She understood something you didn't, something my entire team of experts, on a payroll of millions, failed to comprehend. The question isn't why she spoke up, Marcus. It's why none of you did." He walked slowly toward Amina, stopping a respectful distance away. "What is your name?" "Amina Diallo, sir." "And where, Ms. Diallo?" he asked, his voice softer now, laced with a genuine, burning curiosity. "Did you learn to dismantle a legal argument in a language most of my people can't even order coffee in?" The question hung in the air, a bridge between two worlds. The meeting was over, but the real negotiation had just begun. Elias Vance, a man who thought he had all the answers, was left alone in his glass tower, confronted by a single, unnerving reality. The most valuable asset in the room wasn't on his balance sheet. She had been serving him water. He looked from Amina's calm, intelligent face to Marcus's furious, defensive one. And for the first time in 3 years, a deep, unsettling seed of doubt began to sprout in the barren ground of his certainty. At that moment, the billionaire realized the woman he had allowed his COO to humiliate might be the only person who could save him. If you believe that true worth lies not in a job title but in character and courage, give us a like to support Amina's journey, and let us know where you're watching from in the comments below. Elias dismissed a sputtering Marcus Thorne with a curt wave of his hand, leaving him alone in the cavernous boardroom with Amina. The power dynamic had shifted so completely it was almost a physical force. He gestured toward the head of the table, to the plush leather chair Marcus had just vacated. "Please, Ms. Diallo, sit." Amina moved to the chair but did not sit. It felt like a test, and she chose to meet it on her own terms, standing. Elias didn't press the issue. He walked to the window, his back to her, and stared out at the sprawling city below. "I expect a full explanation," he said, his voice reflecting off the glass. "And I expect it to be the truth." "The truth is, sir," Amina began, her voice as steady as it had been before, "that I have a master's degree in international relations from Georgetown University, with a specialization in Middle Eastern economic policy." Elias turned around slowly, his face betraying a flicker of genuine surprise. "Go on. My father was a diplomat. I spent 10 years of my childhood in Riyadh and Abu Dhabi. I am fluent in 3 languages, including the dialect you used. For 3 years, I worked as a risk analyst for a sovereign wealth fund, reviewing cross-border contracts. Not unlike this one." Elias absorbed this, the pieces of the puzzle beginning to form a picture he did not like. "And that brings you to serving water in my conference room. How my mother became ill," Amina said, a shadow passing over her features. "I came home to San Francisco to care for her. After she passed, the 2-year gap in my employment history became problematic. Recruiters were hesitant. Your company's HR department, for instance, has rejected my online application for analyst positions 6 times in the last year without an interview." The statement landed like a quiet accusation. His company. a supposed meritocracy, had an automated system that filtered out a candidate like her. He felt a flash of anger, not at her, but at the flawed, blind system he had built. He strode to his personal tablet, his fingers flying across the screen. What was the name of the fund you worked for? Amina told him. Elias's search was swift. Within moments, a series of articles and press releases appeared on the screen. He saw her name listed in the acknowledgements of a complex financial report on Gulf Cooperation Council trade agreements. He saw a grainy photo of her, younger, seated at a conference table in Dubai, looking every bit the part of a high-powered analyst. The proof was irrefutable. The woman standing before him was not an anomaly. She was an expert hiding in plain sight. He looked up from the tablet, his mind reeling with the implications. It wasn't just that his team had missed the linguistic trap. It was that they had been outmaneuvered by someone they hadn't even deemed worthy of a second glance. And Marcus had not only overlooked her, he had actively humiliated her. "My assistant will escort you to a temporary office," Elias said, his tone all business now. The shock hardening into resolve. "I am sending you the full, unredacted contract and all associated annexes. I want you to tear it apart, find every weakness, every ambiguity, every single doorway hidden in the fine print. You have until tomorrow morning." As Amina nodded and turned to leave, he called out her name. "Ms. Diallo." She paused at the door. "You will be compensated for your time at the highest consultant rate," he stated, effective immediately. It was more than a gesture of fairness. It was an apology. The only way a man like him knew how to offer one. And as she walked out, Elias Vance was left with the chilling realization that the biggest risk to his company wasn't in a foreign contract, but right there, in his own house. The temporary office Elias's assistant led her to was a small, sterile glass box, typically reserved for visiting consultants. But to Amina, it felt like a kingdom. For the first time in over 2 years, she was being judged not by her uniform, but by her intellect. As the door closed, leaving her in the quiet solitude, she allowed herself a single, deep, shuddering breath. The adrenaline that had carried her through the confrontation began to recede, replaced by the familiar, electric hum of analytical focus. She took off the jacket of her uniform, folded it neatly over the back of a chair, and sat down at the large mahogany desk. The contract, a formidable document of over 300 pages, appeared on the screen in front of her. She began to read. Hours bled into one another. The sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in fiery strokes of orange and purple. But Amina didn't notice. The city lights began to glitter like a spilled box of jewels, but her world was confined to the glowing words on the screen. She worked with a ferocious intensity, fueled by coffee and the sheer, liberating joy of using a part of her mind that had been dormant for too long. Sticky notes began to pepper her desk, each one a red flag, a question, a point of vulnerability. Around 10 p.m., there was a soft knock on the door. Elias Vance entered, carrying 2 cups of what smelled like strong, black coffee. He had shed his suit jacket and tie, and his sleeves were rolled up, revealing the forearms of a man who hadn't always worked behind a desk. He looked tired, but the earlier coldness in his eyes had been replaced by a watchful intensity. "I thought you might need this," he said, placing one of the cups on her desk. "Thank you, sir," she replied, not looking up from a particularly convoluted section on intellectual property rights. He didn't leave. Instead, he took the chair opposite her, creating an unspoken truce in the small office. He watched her for a moment, the way her pen flew across a notepad, the way she would occasionally murmur a phrase in Arabic to herself, testing its sound, its weight. "Why didn't you tell me?" he finally asked, the question quiet but direct. "Why didn't you walk into my office with your resume and demand a job you were clearly overqualified for?" Amina finally looked up, her eyes weary but clear. She leaned back, the gesture a sign that she was willing to share more than just her professional analysis. "Because I tried," she said simply, "not just here, but at a dozen other firms. I walked into lobbies with my degrees in hand. I spoke to receptionists. I sent emails to executives I found on LinkedIn. Do you know what they saw? Mr. Vance." She didn't wait for him to answer. They saw a black woman whose last listed employment was personal caregiver. They saw a 2-year gap they couldn't quantify. They heard an ethnic name and made assumptions. They didn't see a Georgetown grad or a risk analyst. They saw a problem to be politely dismissed. Her voice held no self-pity, only the calm, cutting edge of truth. "My mother. She was a proud woman. She worked as a nurse her whole life. She taught me that dignity isn't something people give you. It's something you refuse to let them take away. When she got sick, leaving my career wasn't a choice. It was a duty, an honor. But the world we operate in," she gestured to the glittering city outside, "doesn't have a column for honor on its balance sheets." She took a sip of coffee. "So I stopped trying to break down the front door. I took a service job because it paid the bills. It was honest work, and it allowed me to be invisible. And in some ways, invisibility is a kind of power. You hear things, you see things. You learn to read the currents of a place without anyone ever knowing you're there." Elias listened, the silence in the room heavy with the weight of her words. He thought of his own insulated existence, of the layers of assistants and executives who buffered him from the world. He had built a fortress around himself, while this woman had been forced to navigate a world that erected walls in front of her at every turn. Her story was not just about a career derailed by tragedy. It was a quiet indictment of the very system he presided over. A system that valued pedigrees over potential and convenience over character. He had nearly signed a contract that would have cost him millions, but the real cost, he was beginning to understand, was the human talent his own company had deemed worthless. As the first hints of dawn painted the sky a soft, bruised purple, Amina leaned back from the screen, her eyes gritty with exhaustion but alight with the fire of discovery. What she had found was far more insidious than a simple linguistic loophole. The problematic clause Elias had used in his test was merely the tip of a sophisticated, deeply embedded spear aimed directly at the heart of his company. She had printed out key sections, spreading them across the desk like a detective laying out evidence. When Elias knocked and entered the office at 6 a.m., he found her standing over the documents, a grim, focused expression on her face. "It's worse than we thought," she said, her voice raspy from lack of sleep. She didn't wait for him to ask questions. She launched directly into her findings. The linguistic ambiguity was a distraction, A clever piece of misdirection, a magician's trick to make you look at one hand while the other performs the real deception. She pointed to a section in the financial annexes. The real trap isn't in the language, it's in the numbers. Specifically, in the valuation of the intellectual property we're licensing. She slid a highlighted page toward him. Here, they've agreed to our valuation for the core software, which is fair. But look at this footnote, Appendix C, Section 2. It references ancillary technological assets. It's a deliberately vague term. There's no itemized list, no specific valuation for these assets. Elias frowned, leaning over the document. It's a standard catch-all. Legal uses it in every contract. Exactly. Amina countered. It's meant to look standard, but I cross-referenced this with the project's technical schematics. Ancillary assets in this context doesn't just mean minor patents or code libraries. It includes the entire proprietary AI learning algorithm for our next-generation platform, Project Chimera. A project that isn't even part of this deal. Elias straightened up, his face paling. That's impossible. Chimera is a black box project. Its assets are firewalled, held under a separate subsidiary. And that subsidiary, Amina said, sliding another document across the desk, is listed right here in a schedule of corporate entities attached to the main agreement. It's buried on page 287, mislabeled as a holding company for legacy software. She tapped a name on the page, Vance Legacy Systems, LLC. The room went cold. Vance Legacy Systems was the shell corporation Lena had created years ago. A place to park dormant assets. It was a name only a handful of people within the company even knew existed. If you sign this, Mr. Vance, Amina concluded, her voice low and steady. You're not just licensing your current technology. You're giving them a back door to claim co-ownership of your company's entire future, for pennies on the dollar. The linguistic trap I pointed out yesterday. That was just the key. This, she swept a hand over the scattered papers, is the doorway it was designed to unlock. The full scope of the deception crashed down on Elias with the force of a physical blow. This wasn't a hard-nosed negotiation tactic. It was a corporate assassination attempt. It was a meticulously planned, deeply informed conspiracy designed to gut his company from the inside out. And the most terrifying part was that the information used to build the trap, the existence of Chimera, the name of the shell company, could only have come from someone with the highest level of access, someone he trusted, someone like Marcus Thorne. Elias's first instinct was to storm into Marcus Thorne's office, to confront him with the evidence and watch the man's carefully constructed world crumble. But Amina's quiet composure acted as an anchor. He won't confess, she warned, her voice pulling him back from the edge of his rage. He'll deny everything, shred the evidence, and paint you as a paranoid, grieving man seeing shadows. We have the what, but we don't have the who signed off on this. Not yet. She was right. A public accusation without irrefutable proof would be a declaration of war, one that could tear the company apart and spook the stock market. They needed to move with the precision of a surgeon, not the fury of a wrecking ball. But they were too late. Marcus Thorne was more cunning than they anticipated. He must have sensed the shift in Elias's demeanor, the sudden, icy distance. He knew he was being watched, and so he struck first. The attack came not as a direct confrontation, but as a series of poisoned whispers that began to circulate through the company's upper echelons. By mid-morning, the story was spreading like a virus through the encrypted chat channels of the executive floor. The Saudi deal was in jeopardy, stalled by the CEO's erratic behavior. He had brought in an outside consultant, some woman, a former caterer of all things, and she was filling his head with conspiracy theories. The narrative was insidious and brilliant in its simplicity. It didn't attack Elias directly. It questioned his judgment. It painted Amina not as an expert, but as an opportunistic interloper, a siren charming a lonely, grieving widower. The seeds of doubt were planted. Elias, still mourning his wife, was being manipulated. His emotional vulnerability was compromising his business acumen. By noon, 2 senior board members had requested a private, off-the-record meeting with Elias. They were polite but firm. "Elias, we're hearing concerning things." One of them, a man named Henderson, began. "About this new advisor. We're worried about the optics. Halting a deal of this magnitude based on the word of an unvetted third party is risky." The trap was elegantly sprung. Marcus wasn't just defending himself, he was using the company's own mechanisms of governance to neutralize the threat. He was turning the board, Elias's own source of authority, against him. The second phase of his counterattack was aimed directly at Amina. As she worked in her temporary office, she received an email from Human Resources. It was a formal notice of an internal review. Subject: potential conflict of interest and breach of employee conduct policy. The email stated that a complaint had been filed regarding her unauthorized access to sensitive corporate materials and her inappropriate professional relationship with a senior executive. It was a thinly veiled threat, a bureaucratic noose designed to intimidate and discredit her. Marcus was cornering them. He was using his intimate knowledge of the corporate structure to isolate Elias and marginalize Amina. He was destroying her credibility before she even had a chance to present her findings. Elias felt a cold dread creep into his gut. He was fighting a ghost, a predator who knew the terrain of their shared world far better than he did. Every move he considered, Marcus seemed to have anticipated, building a defensive wall of plausible deniability and corporate red tape. The truth was in his hands, but it was useless if no one was willing to listen. Elias and Amina were trapped in a tightening net. The board was wavering, swayed by Marcus's carefully orchestrated campaign of whispers. Amina's credibility was under direct assault from an HR investigation that was, in reality, a sham trial. Every official channel they considered seemed to lead to a dead end, blocked by Marcus's influence or the board's escalating panic. They were paralyzed, holding a bomb of a truth they couldn't defuse without blowing themselves up in the process. "He's using the system against us," Elias said, pacing the length of his office. The view of the bay, once a symbol of his power, now felt like the walls of a gilded cage. Every department, every protocol. He knows how to manipulate them. He's insulated himself perfectly. Amina, who had been methodically mapping out the corporate hierarchy on a whiteboard, paused. Her eyes scanned the names and titles, the lines of authority, almost perfectly. she corrected softly. He controls operations, legal, and he has the board's ear. But there's one department that operates differently. One person who doesn't report to him. She tapped a name on the board, circled in green. Isabel Rossi, head of human resources. Elias frowned. Isabel. She's been with the company for 30 years. She's old guard, principled, but quiet. She's HR. Amina. She's the one who sent you the investigation notice. Exactly. Amina countered. The notice was professionally worded, by the book. It had to be. But who filed the initial complaint? The email doesn't say. It's an anonymous submission, which means it could have come from Marcus himself. Isabel is a gatekeeper. She processes the information, but that doesn't mean she believes it. Amina's eyes held a strategic gleam, and more importantly, she was hired by your wife. The words hit Elias with unexpected force. Lena had brought Isabel in decades ago. The two women had been close, sharing a vision for the company that went beyond profit margins. Isabel Rossi wasn't just an employee, she was a steward of Lena's legacy. Elias made the call. Isabel, it's Elias. I need to see you. Now. My private conference room. And come alone. Isabel Rossi entered the room with the quiet dignity of a woman who had seen countless corporate storms come and go. She was in her late 60s, her silver hair pulled back in a neat chignon, her eyes sharp and intelligent behind elegant glasses. She listened without interruption as Elias and Amina laid out everything: the linguistic trap, the IP theft, the shell company, and Marcus's campaign to discredit them. When they finished, she didn't express shock or disbelief. Instead, she gave a slow, knowing nod, as if they had just confirmed a suspicion she had harbored for years. I was wondering when you would finally see it, she said, her voice calm and steady. She looked at Elias with a gaze that was both sympathetic and stern. After Lena passed, you gave Marcus too much control. You were grieving, and he took advantage of your trust. I've seen the patterns. Good people, talented people, quietly pushed out or reassigned if they questioned his decisions. Budgets mysteriously shifting. I never had proof. Only a feeling. She then turned her attention to Amina, studying her not as an employee, but as a peer. The HR complaint was filed by an anonymous portal, but the IP address traces back to a computer in the COO's executive suite. I am legally obligated to investigate it. But a small, determined smile touched her lips. An investigation can take a very, very long time, especially when the lead investigator is thorough. She rose and walked to the room's secure document cabinet. Using a key Elias hadn't seen in years, she opened a drawer and retrieved a single, slim, dust-covered binder. Marcus believes all the old paper records were digitized and shredded. He oversaw the project himself, Isabel said, placing the binder on the table. But Lena was cautious. She insisted that all founding partnership agreements and initial acquisition records be kept as hard copies, stored under a separate archival protocol. She opened the binder. I don't know what's in here, but Lena told me once, if this company ever loses its way, The map back to the beginning is in here. Perhaps, she concluded, her eyes meeting theirs, you'll find the evidence you're looking for. The binder Isabel Rossi produced was a time capsule, a relic from the company's genesis. The pages were thick, the typewritten words slightly faded. It was a world away from the slick, digital contracts of today. As Elias and Amina began to sift through the documents, they were not just reviewing old paperwork. They were excavating the very soul of Vance Innovations. For hours, they found nothing but the expected initial incorporation papers, early partnership agreements, the optimistic, ambitious language of a startup destined for greatness. It all seemed straightforward, a clean history of a company built on a brilliant idea. Maybe there's nothing here, Elias murmured, a wave of frustration washing over him. Wait, Amina said, her finger tracing a line on a brittle, yellowed page. Look at this. She pointed to a document near the back of the binder. It was the original acquisition agreement for a small, defunct software company called Helios Data Solutions, purchased by Vance Innovations nearly 15 years ago. It was one of their first major acquisitions, the one that had given them the foundational technology for their flagship product. The acquisition itself was unremarkable. What was remarkable were the signatures at the bottom of the page. Representing Vance Innovations were Elias Vance and his late wife, Lena. Representing Helios Data Solutions was its founder and CEO, Marcus Thorne. Elias stared at the page, a cold, sickening sense of dread coiling in his stomach. He had completely forgotten. In the whirlwind of the company's explosive growth, the name Helios Data had faded into a footnote, a minor detail in a grand success story. Marcus had come to them as part of the acquisition, a talented young executive from a failing company. Elias had seen his drive, his ambition, and had taken him under his wing, mentoring him, promoting him, eventually trusting him with the keys to the kingdom. But Isabel, their unexpected ally, knew the real story. She had been with the company then, a mid-level HR manager, and she remembered the acquisition not as a success, but as a tragedy. A phone call brought her into the room, and she saw the document they were looking at. That deal, Isabel began, her voice low, heavy with the weight of a long-held secret. It wasn't a straightforward purchase. Elias, Helios Data wasn't just failing, it was driven into the ground. She then recounted the story that the official corporate history had conveniently omitted. Marcus Thorne, she explained, hadn't been the sole founder of Helios Data. He had a partner, a brilliant programmer named Julian Croft, who was the true architect of the technology.